The palace was huge, bigger than anything the human had ever seen. Towers reached into the sky, shining with strange lights. The walls were smooth and cold, and the floors reflected every movement. The humans who lived here were few, and most of them were servants, cleaners, or workers. They were small and fragile compared to the aliens. The janitor, named Thomas, was one of them. He was a quiet man used to being ignored. He moved carefully through the hallways, pushing his cleaning cart. Every step echoed in the empty corridors. The aliens in the palace were tall and proud. Their skin shined in colors humans could not name, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. They moved with grace and authority. Thomas had learned quickly to stay out of their way. One wrong move, one wrong word, and he could be scolded or dismissed. But he did his work carefully. He cleaned the floors until they shone, polished the doors, and emptied the strange machines that humans called trash bins. No one thanked him. No one noticed. That was normal. Thomas had been working in the palace for many months. He had seen everything from afar: grand feasts, important meetings, and the emperor himself, sitting high on his golden throne, silent and intimidating. The emperor never spoke without reason, and his eyes seemed to see everything. Thomas had learned to bow and step aside whenever the emperor walked near. The other humans whispered that he was brave to stay so calm. Some aliens laughed quietly at him, saying humans were weak, too small to matter. Thomas did not care. He did not need their respect. He only wanted to do his work and stay alive. One morning, Thomas entered a hall he had not cleaned before. The floor was vast and shiny, stretching as far as the eye could see. Golden columns rose from the floor to the ceiling, and paintings of past rulers looked down from the walls. He carefully pushed his cart along, polishing the floors. The echo of his mop against the tiles sounded loud in the empty hall. Suddenly he heard something soft. A sound he had never heard in all his months here. It was a low, muffled crying. Thomas stopped and listened. The sound came from a smaller side corridor, one that was usually locked for humans. His heart beat faster. He had been told never to enter that corridor. But the crying sounded small and afraid. It did not seem dangerous. He slowly walked toward it. The crying grew louder, soft but full of sadness. Thomas's hand shook as he pushed the door open slightly. Inside he saw a young alien sitting on the floor. The alien's skin was a soft silver, and his eyes glowed a pale blue. His small hands were trembling, and he was looking at his boots, which were loose and untied. Thomas's first thought was surprise. He had never seen an alien prince cry. They were supposed to be strong, proud, and perfect. But here was one, small and scared, unable to do something as simple as tie his shoes. The prince tried to hide his face, but the tears fell anyway. Thomas felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had cleaned this palace for months, seen the pride and the fear of the powerful, but never had he felt so close to someone like this. The prince looked up and saw Thomas standing in the doorway. His eyes widened and he shook his head, embarrassed. I can't do it," he whispered. His voice was soft, almost breaking. Thomas knelt slowly in front of him, careful not to frighten him more. "It's okay," he said gently. "I can help." The prince hesitated. No noble had ever allowed a human to touch them. He was supposed to be perfect, untouchable. But no one else was there, and he was small and scared. He nodded slightly. Thomas smiled quietly and reached for the untied boots. He worked slowly, making sure not to hurt the prince's feet. He tied the laces carefully, knot by knot, explaining each step in a calm, soft voice. "There," Thomas said, stepping back. "All done." The prince looked at his boots. They were neat and perfect now. He blinked, trying to hide his tears, but a small smile appeared. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time anyone had ever said anything kind to him in the palace. Thomas nodded. "You did well," he said. "Sometimes even the strongest need a little help." Unknown to them, high above in a balcony, the emperor was watching. His eyes were sharp, silent, and unreadable. He saw the human kneeling, helping the young prince. He saw the prince's fear turn into relief. And he saw the quiet courage of a human who had no power, no rank, but something stronger than fear. The emperor said nothing. He never moved. But inside something changed. Thomas stood up slowly, gathered his cleaning supplies, and pushed his cart down the hall. The prince watched him go, feeling something he had never felt before: safety. The palace was still big, still cold, and the aliens were still proud and distant. But for one small moment, kindness had entered the halls. And in that moment, even the highest walls could not stop the human heart. Thomas did not think of praise. He did not expect it. He only thought of the prince and of the small difference a simple act could make. In the palace, humans were the lowest rank. But sometimes, Even the lowest could do the greatest things. And somewhere above, the Emperor continued to watch in silence, knowing he had seen something remarkable. The crying continued, soft and trembling, echoing down the small corridor. The prince had curled up on the floor, hiding his face in his hands. Thomas paused at the doorway, unsure if he should go further. He had helped the prince before, but this time it was different. The young alien was not just struggling with his boots. He was afraid of something much bigger. Something no one dared to speak of. The corridors smelled faintly of polished stone and warm light from the tall windows. Outside, the palace gardens glowed with the morning sun, but inside, the halls were quiet, almost empty. Thomas took a small step forward. His boots made a soft sound against the tiles. The prince lifted his head slightly, eyes wide and full of tears. He looked small and fragile, like a child lost in a world too big for him. Thomas knelt down carefully, keeping his distance, but close enough to offer comfort. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're not alone." The prince shook his head. I'm supposed to be strong," he whispered. "I'm supposed to do everything perfectly. But I can't." His voice cracked and the tears fell faster. Thomas could see the fear in his eyes. The prince was not just afraid of failure. He was afraid of everyone seeing him fail. In the palace, mistakes were not forgiven. Pride and power were everything. But here, in this quiet corridor, the prince was just a child. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth. He handed it to the prince. "Here," he said softly. "You can wipe your tears. It's okay to cry. Even the strongest cry sometimes." The prince took the cloth, hands shaking. He wiped his eyes and looked at Thomas, unsure. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. No noble, no teacher, no servant, except maybe his mother long ago. The prince's lips trembled as he tried to speak. Why are you helping me?" Thomas smiled gently. "Because it's the right thing to do. Everyone deserves help when they need it. You're not weak for crying. You're human, or well, you're like everyone else. You need care sometimes." The prince blinked, confused. He had heard of humans before. They were small, fragile, and mostly servants. They cleaned, cooked, and followed orders. They were not supposed to be brave. They were not supposed to have strength. But Thomas was different. Quiet, careful, patient, and unafraid of the prince's tears. The prince tried to stand, but his legs wobbled. He sank back to the floor, embarrassed. "I can't," he said softly. "I can't even walk straight." Thomas reached out a hand. "Then let me help you." He pulled the prince gently up by the arm. The young alien leaned on him, shivering slightly. Together, they moved to a small bench near the corridor window. Sunlight streamed in, painting the floor gold and silver. For the first time that morning, the prince felt warmth that was not just from the sun. "You see," Thomas said, "it's okay to ask for help. Even leaders need help sometimes. Even emperors need help. Strength is not only in standing alone. Strength is in knowing when to accept kindness." The prince listened, trying to understand. His tears slowed. His small hands clutched at Thomas's sleeves, unsure if he should let go. He had been told his whole life that showing fear was shameful. But this human was kind, and the world suddenly felt less frightening. Thomas knelt on the floor, tying the prince's boots again, making sure the laces were neat and firm. He worked slowly, talking softly. "Life is full of steps, little ones and big ones. You learn to take them one at a time. Sometimes you fall. Sometimes you cry. But you keep moving forward. That is what makes you strong." The prince watched him, eyes wide and shining. He wanted to believe these words. He wanted to feel brave. Slowly, a small smile appeared. It was shy and quiet, but it was real. For the first time, he felt hope instead of fear. They did not hear the soft footsteps above. The emperor stood silently on the balcony overlooking the corridor. He did not move. He did not speak. He had watched the human kneel before the crying prince, tying his shoes and offering comfort. No one had ever dared to do that. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly, thoughtful. He could have punished the human for overstepping boundaries. But he did not. He could see something he had not seen in a long time. Courage that did not roar, strength that was quiet, and power that came from care. Thomas finished tying the boots and helped the prince stand. "There," he said. "You're ready?" The prince looked down at his shoes, neat and firm, and then up at Thomas. "Thank you," he whispered again. This time there was no hesitation. No shame. Just gratitude. "You're welcome," Thomas said with a small smile. "Remember, it's okay to cry. It's okay to ask for help. You are stronger than you know." The prince nodded, feeling a small courage growing inside him. He had faced his fear and learned something important. that even in a palace full of proud and powerful aliens, one small human could teach him how to be brave. For a moment, the corridor was quiet except for the soft breathing of the two. Outside, the palace gardens glowed, and the world continued, vast and intimidating. But inside this corridor, a young alien prince had learned that he was not alone. And a human janitor had shown that even the lowest rank could make the highest difference. Thomas packed his cleaning supplies quietly, giving the prince one last encouraging nod. He did not expect thanks or praise. He only wanted the prince to feel safe, to feel human. The young prince watched him go, still unsure of the strange new emotions he felt: hope, trust, and perhaps the beginning of courage. And above them, the emperor continued to watch silently, considering what he had just witnessed. A human had done something no alien noble had dared. A human had shown strength where the palace only knew pride. And for the first time in many cycles, the emperor felt the stirrings of respect for the smallest of creatures. The corridor was quiet after Thomas had helped the prince with his boots. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, casting soft light on the smooth floor. The young alien prince, still trembling slightly, sat on the bench. He looked at his boots, neat and tied, but his eyes were full of uncertainty. He had never been helped like this before, never had someone care for him without expecting something in return. Thomas knelt beside him, smiling gently. "Would you like me to help you with something else?" Thomas asked. His voice was soft and calm. The prince hesitated, unsure if he should say yes. In the palace, no noble had ever asked for help, and no servant had ever dared to offer it so openly. But the prince felt safe in Thomas's presence. Slowly he nodded. Thomas reached into his cart and pulled out a small cloth and some water. "Sometimes little things make a big difference," he said. "Cleaning your hands or your face can help you feel ready for the day." The prince looked at him curiously. He had never thought that small actions mattered. He had been trained to think only of power, rank, and perfection. But this human showed him a different kind of strength, gentle, patient, and steady. Thomas knelt closer and helped the prince wipe his face. The prince's hands were small and trembling, but he copied Thomas's movements carefully. The human spoke quietly as he worked. "It's not shameful to need help. Even the strongest creatures in the universe rely on others sometimes. You are not weak for accepting it." The prince listened. He had never heard words like these before. The palace was full of commands, orders, and expectations. No one had ever spoken to him about care, patience, or kindness. He felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was not fear, pride, or anger. It was something new: trust. After a moment, Thomas looked at the prince's hands. They were shaking less now. "There," he said softly. "You are ready." The prince blinked. "Ready for what?" he asked quietly. Thomas smiled. "Ready to face the day. Ready to take the next steps, whatever they may be. You do not have to be perfect. You only have to try." The prince's small shoulders relaxed. He had been trained to hide all weakness, to appear flawless, but Thomas's words made him feel that it was okay to be human, or at least to feel human emotions. He realized that strength did not mean never falling. It meant rising when you could. The corridor was still, but neither of them noticed the soft footsteps above. The emperor was watching. His gaze was steady, silent, and observant. He had seen humans in the palace before, of course. They were small, fragile, and weak. But he had never seen one act with such calm courage, with such care for another being. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. He considered what he had just witnessed. A human had knelt for an alien prince and shown patience and understanding. That simple act was more powerful than any show of strength he had ever commanded. Thomas stood slowly and nodded at the prince. "You did well today. Remember, asking for help is a sign of strength. Not everyone will understand it, but it is true." The prince tried to speak but found no words. His throat felt tight. He wanted to say something more, but the simple act of gratitude seemed enough for now. He nodded, letting the human know he understood. Thomas packed his supplies quietly, ready to return to his work. But before he left, he placed a hand gently on the prince's shoulder. "You will be okay," he said. "You are stronger than you think." The prince looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw a reflection of courage that was not forced, not learned, but natural. Thomas had not been trained as a warrior or a leader. He had not been taught etiquette or power. He was a janitor, the lowest rank in the palace, yet he had shown something far greater than any noble could: the power of kindness. For the prince, this simple human act became a turning point. He realized that being brave did not always mean facing enemies or winning battles. Sometimes, it meant letting someone help you, accepting care and learning from it. The palace, with all its rules and pride, seemed a little smaller, a little less frightening. Thomas finally pushed his cleaning cart down the corridor, leaving the prince alone for a few moments. The young alien prince watched him go, feeling the warmth of the human's guidance still lingering in his heart. He touched his neatly tied boots, then looked out the window. The gardens were bright and full of life. He understood something new. Even in a world full of power and fear, small acts could change everything. High above, the emperor remained silent on the balcony. His eyes had not left the corridor. He saw the prince's small smile, the way he lifted his head a little higher. He saw Thomas walk away quietly doing his work, unnoticed by most, yet affecting the future in ways no one could see. The emperor did not speak. He did not move. But inside he felt a stirring he had not felt in many cycles. He recognized that strength could be quiet. He recognized that humans, weak as they seemed, could teach lessons no warrior could. The prince took a deep breath and stood tall, feeling a small confidence growing within him. He would face the day and the challenges ahead differently. He would try even if he failed. And he would remember the simple human act that had shown him that courage could come in small packages, from the most unexpected places. The palace continued to hum with life. Nobles moved through grand halls, servants went about their tasks, and the emperor watched silently. But in that quiet corridor, a small miracle had occurred. A janitor, a human, had helped a young alien prince. He had tied his shoes, calmed his fear, and given him a lesson in courage. And in doing so, he had changed something far greater than he could imagine. The human janitor walked away, humble and quiet, leaving behind a prince who had learned a new kind of strength. And high above, the emperor continued to watch, knowing that he had witnessed a rare and extraordinary act. The palace halls were quiet but not empty. Servants moved quickly, nobles whispered in corridors, and the emperor sat high above, observing everything. No one dared approach him directly. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words carried the weight of the entire empire. Today, however, his eyes were fixed on a single event in a small corridor below. A human janitor had knelt before the alien prince, tying his boots, calming his fear, and showing care where no one else had dared. The emperor's mind worked quietly, noting every detail. For a long time he remembered his own youth. He had been trained to be strong, to hide weakness, and to command respect through fear and precision. Showing care was a sign of weakness, and kindness was something only the naive allowed themselves. The palace had always rewarded pride and punished softness. Yet, watching Thomas, the emperor felt something unfamiliar. The human's courage was not loud. It did not demand attention or accolades. It was calm, patient, and steady. In a world full of rules and hierarchy, that simple act had a weight no sword could match. The alien prince stood nearby, still small, still trembling slightly, but his posture had changed. He had learned a lesson today that no teacher or noble could give. He had seen that strength did not always mean standing alone. It could come from letting someone help you, from accepting care, and from acting with patience and heart. Thomas had given him this understanding without force, without demand, only through a simple, quiet act. The emperor's gaze shifted to the human janitor, who was quietly collecting his cleaning supplies. Thomas moved with careful attention, bending to polish a corner of the floor, pushing his cart methodically. No one in the palace would have noticed him if they had not looked carefully. Yet his presence, so unassuming, had changed something invisible but powerful. The emperor understood that strength could be hidden, and sometimes the smallest gestures had the greatest effect. He considered what could happen if the palace recorded this event. A human had dared to act boldly yet gently in a world that prized power above all. The young prince had accepted this help without shame. That combination of trust and courage, the emperor realized, could teach more than 100 lessons of discipline or etiquette. He wondered what would happen if such acts were allowed to continue. Could his empire grow stronger not just through fear and obedience, but through care and understanding? The emperor leaned back on his golden throne, silent as ever. Other officials expected him to speak, to command punishment for the human's boldness. Many would have considered it an overstep, a breach of palace protocol. But he said nothing. He thought carefully. Punishment would discourage courage. Reward might disrupt the balance of power. Yet inaction in this case carried its own lesson. By choosing to do nothing, he acknowledged the human's bravery, the prince's trust, and the quiet power of kindness. Meanwhile, the prince walked slowly toward the window, watching the gardens below. The morning sun warmed his skin and the flowers glowed in bright colors. He remembered Thomas's words, that asking for help was not weakness, that strength came from learning and trying, not from fear or pride. He realized he could face challenges differently, one small step at a time. He did not need to be perfect, only willing. That was a freedom he had never known before. Thomas returned to his work quietly, pushing the cart down the corridor. He polished the tiles, gathered the dust, and moved carefully so as not to disturb anyone. To the palace he was a lowly human, a janitor barely noticed. Yet his actions had changed the course of someone's life, and perhaps, in time, the thoughts of the emperor himself. Strength, he thought silently, was not measured by rank or size, but by courage, patience, and the heart. The emperor continued to watch from above. He reflected on the traditions of the palace, the endless cycles of pride and command. He considered the potential for change, small as it might be. A human had entered this world, quiet and unassuming, and had shown what the alien rulers had never considered: that acts of kindness, patience, and understanding could inspire courage even in the most frightened hearts. The officials whispered among themselves, but none dared question the emperor's silence. He had seen the human, the prince, and the quiet exchange of trust. He had felt the weight of a lesson far stronger than words or orders. And he knew that the empire, so focused on power, might learn something new if such acts continued. For the young prince, this moment was unforgettable. He walked carefully along the corridor, boots tied neatly, shoulders lifted slightly higher than before. He had felt fear, sadness, and embarrassment, but he had also felt care, support, and the beginning of courage. One small act had shifted something deep within him. He understood that strength could come from accepting help, from trusting others, and from the courage to be human. Thomas finished his cleaning, packed his supplies, and moved quietly toward the next corridor. He did not speak of what had happened, nor did he expect praise. He only hoped the prince would remember that day, that he would carry forward the lesson of patience, courage, and care. The emperor remained silent, observing the human as he left. A simple act, small by most measures, had changed something profound. The palace, with its endless halls and towering ceilings, seemed a little less cold, a little less rigid. Even in the highest places, the heart could influence the mind. Even the smallest human could teach a prince, and an emperor, a lesson no one had anticipated. The corridor was empty now. The sun lit the tiles, the walls glowed with warmth, and the palace continued its rhythm of life. But the memory of the simple act remained. A human had knelt before an alien prince, tying his boots, calming his fear, and offering care without expectation. That moment, quiet and unassuming, had changed everything. And somewhere high above, the emperor sat in silence, considering the lesson of courage, kindness, and strength that had been delivered in the humblest of ways. Time passed in the palace. Days turned into cycles, and the corridors that once seemed cold and empty now carried quiet changes. The human janitor, Thomas, continued his work as always, polishing floors, cleaning windows, and pushing his cart along the long halls. To most he was still the same lowly human, invisible and unnoticed. But those who had witnessed the moment with the prince remembered it. It had left a small mark, not loud or obvious, but deep and lasting. The young alien prince had grown. He was taller now, stronger and more confident. Yet, despite his growth, he remembered the day Thomas had tied his boots, the day he had been comforted and taught that asking for help was not weakness. The prince had learned that true courage was not just in standing tall, but in trusting, accepting care, and acting with patience. That lesson guided him in every decision, every meeting, and every encounter. The palace had changed subtly as well. Nobles began to notice small acts of kindness and cooperation. They whispered among themselves, seeing the difference it made to the prince. A gentle word, a small gesture of care, and the young prince responded with respect and strength. They began to realize that power was not only in authority or fear, but in understanding, patience, and courage. The palace was still strict, still proud, but the seed of something new had been planted. Thomas continued his work quietly, never seeking recognition. He polished the floors with the same care, swept the corridors with steady hands, and cleaned without complaint. He never boasted, never demanded attention. Yet his presence became a symbol of humility and strength. The humans in the palace looked up to him quietly, seeing that even the lowest rank could hold dignity and courage. One day the prince, now older and wiser, walked toward Thomas in the corridor. His boots were polished, his robes neat, but his eyes carried a warmth and respect that had not been there before. "Thomas," he said softly, "I remember what you taught me. I will never forget it. You showed me courage and care in a way no one else could. Thank you." Thomas smiled gently. "You have grown strong on your own," he said. "I only helped you take the first step. The rest was yours." The prince nodded. He had learned that strength was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and kind. The lessons Thomas had given him, simple acts of care and patience, shaped the person he had become. The Empire had trained him in rules and power, but it was a human who had taught him courage and compassion. High above, the Emperor watched silently. He had observed the years quietly, seeing the changes in the young prince and in the palace itself. He remembered the first moment he saw Thomas kneel before the crying prince. That small act had shifted something deep within him. He realized that strength was not only in fear or command, but in patience, care, and understanding. Even the smallest humans could teach lessons no noble could. The Emperor spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. In a private meeting with his advisors, he praised the young prince not for victories or power, but for his patience, his kindness, and his courage. The advisors were surprised. "But, Your Majesty," they said, "power is strength. Fear is respect." The Emperor shook his head gently. "True strength," he said softly, "is knowing when to be patient, when to accept help, and when to act with care. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, and sometimes it comes from the smallest of beings." The palace slowly changed. Nobles began to treat their subordinates with more respect, humans were acknowledged for their efforts, and the corridors that once echoed only with commands now carried soft words, gentle reminders, and quiet acts of care. The Empire, once proud and cold, began to recognize the value of courage, kindness, and understanding. Thomas continued to clean quietly, never seeking reward, but his influence spread in ways he would never know. The young prince, now a ruler in his own right, carried the lessons of that day with him. He showed patience, understanding, and courage, shaping the empire into a place where strength was measured not only by power, but by heart. The prince often remembered that moment in the corridor, the fear, the tears, the human kneeling to help. He remembered Thomas's words about courage and asking for help. He realized that it had changed him forever. He passed those lessons to others, teaching future leaders that small acts could have the greatest impact. And somewhere high above, the Emperor observed silently, reflecting on the power of one human act. A janitor, small and unassuming, had shifted the course of a prince, the palace, and perhaps even the empire itself. No one celebrated Thomas. No banners were raised. No songs were sung. Yet his legacy was alive, growing quietly in the hearts of those who had witnessed it and in the generations that would follow. The palace, once towering and intimidating, felt warmer now. The halls still echoed, but the echoes carried patience and understanding alongside commands and tradition. The young prince had grown into a leader admired not just for power, but for courage, empathy, and wisdom. And the human janitor, invisible to most, had shown that the greatest strength comes not from fear or authority, but from kindness, patience, and the courage to help. As Thomas walked through the corridors one final time that day, the prince watched him, silently grateful. The emperor remained in his seat above, watching too, and finally, perhaps, understanding that the smallest acts could shape the greatest legacies. The human janitor had done nothing extraordinary by the world's measure. He had tied boots, offered care, and spoken gentle words. But in the heart of a prince, in the mind of an emperor, and in the pulse of an empire, that simple act became a story of courage, kindness, and a legacy stronger than fear. The palace continued, proud and vast, but something had shifted. Humans were no longer invisible. Courage could come from the humblest of beings. And a simple act of care had proven that even the smallest person could change the course of history.